warm welcome. My name is David Byrne. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Faculty of Medical Sciences at Newcastle University. I'm also, and I do think it's relevant given the material that you're going to hear this morning, it's important you know my background because I'm a neurologist who worked in Parkinson's disease and particularly dementia associated with Parkinson's disease. So I have more than a passing interest in the main actor this morning, which is Louise Robinson, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I know here, I know there are a number of very familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces drawn from our alumni, our staff, and also students and friends. And it's great to see you, particularly given the weather and the elements that were thrown at us. And that unfortunately has led to one or two of potential attendees shifting to their online mode. And I know there are colleagues, alumni and friends looking online. So I'm not sure where you're seeing this through, but I would just also like to extend a very warm welcome to you as well. And thank you for joining us. And to say that in the Q&A session that will follow Louise's lecture, we will be interdigitating between live questions from the audience and any questions that we get from you through the Zoom channel. So please don't be worried that your voice will be heard if you would like to send questions through. So basically, why are we here? We're seeing our global community coming together to celebrate Newcastle University in Action 2023. And you've got to be really careful how you say that. I suddenly thought to myself as I was coming across, because yeah, you've got there, haven't you? Sounds like inaction. It's not actually we're in action. We are in action. And this particular theme this year is Age Against the Machine. Now that also kind of sat slightly uncomfortably to me because those of you of a certain age, and I don't think there are too many of you here, possibly one I'm just looking at who's very much into the pop side of things, will think of Rage Against the Machine, who you will all know are an LA-based heavy metal rap band with an unlikely Christmas #1 in 2009. Now, Louise will point out that I like heavy metal, but I do not like rap. In fact, I can't stand it. So it is a bad combination. And so we're called Age without the R Against the Machine. And this is actually Newcastle in Action in its 3rd year. And we're really aiming to try and bring the Newcastle community together to try and work together to tackle some of society's greatest challenges. So this year's programme is focusing how we age better together. Together, we're looking to try and, for example, challenge stereotypes, seize opportunities for generations to learn from each other, which I think is incredibly important, and celebrate the opportunities that our multi-generational society bring to Newcastle. I think it is fair to say, and Louise will definitely allude to this, that we are world leading in our research in aging. I'm delighted to see Jim Edwardson here today, because I would have to say that Jim absolutely sowed the seeds for Newcastle's preeminence in this space through setting up what was known at the time as the IHS, I think it was, Jim, at the very start, wasn't it? Then became the IAH. So it's wonderful that Jim is here today and still very active in that area. So we're going to hear an awful lot in a very varied programme throughout the day. So yes, I mean, Benjamin Franklin's quoted as saying, and I'm sure you all know this one inside out, our new constitution is now established and has an appearance that promises permanence. But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Well, I'm going to disagree with Benjamin Franklin because I think you can add aging to that list as well. We're all getting older, and it's a major, major challenge. Newcastle University historically has tried to tackle those challenges of aging through a very, very broad approach. Jim's original concept was an institute without walls, and I'd like to think that we've tried to perpetuate that as we go forward. We've certainly got, as you're going to hear from Louise, amazing academic assets in the primary care space, looking to prevent illness and reduce health inequalities at a population level, also through our applied research collaborative, which leads nationally in the aging space and inequalities, and the policy research unit that we share with Manchester in older people and frailty. We've also, through Avancea, a geriatrician, developed really quite significant world-leading expertise in multimorbidity, which, let's be honest, is an incredibly common problem, particularly in this part of the world, And by that, I mean people who are growing older with not just one condition, but multiple conditions. And that can often include mental health challenges as well as cognitive impairment. So the system, as you can imagine, in the NHS is not really well set to look after people with multimorbidity. And so an awful lot of the work that we're trying to do here is focused on understanding mechanisms, treatments, but also care pathways there as well. And what about the general hospital site? Those of you of a certain vintage may still know it as the Wingrove. And currently it's known as the Campus for Aging and Vitality. And one thing I can promise you is that I hope the next time I stand up in front of you and give a talk like this, it will no longer be known as CAV. We are looking to rebrand the site, 29 acres, into an amazing health innovation neighborhood, taking a whole systems approach to aging better, drawing on strengths from across the university, outside my own faculty, into the areas of electrification, automatic vehicles that don't need somebody to be actually a human to be driving, the better use of artificial intelligence, using digital care to try and reach out to populations that can be very, very difficult to draw in normally. So there's some really innovative approaches being taken to CAV. And it's not just a pipe dream. We are at the point where a development partner, Generate Kojima Limited, are now involved. We have got planning permission in outline for the development of the site. We're now looking to apply for remediation funding to try and take down the existing buildings, plug the holes that there are around the site, do architectural work to make sure that we're not going to, for example, do unspeakable damage to the Roman wall, which fortunately appears to run east to west on the right side of the road for the site. Those of you who know the layout of the land there, it's on the other side of the Westgate Road, it appears. Anyway, back to today, I really do hope that you're going to take advantage of this diverse program. Obviously, we've got some great speakers, some great lectures, but obviously there's also the chance to practice mental well-being, engage with our partners, speak with experts and make new connections across the generations. I think much of the program, when I look at it, made me realize that the Romans really got it so right by saying mens sana in corpore sano, which, as you all know, is a healthy mind in a healthy body. And I know that Louise Robinson is going to touch on this in her talk of reducing risk of developing dementia, for example. But today is just the beginning. This is the start of the Newcastle in Action. And throughout the month of March, you will have many other opportunities to attend events and volunteer your time and expertise. So keep your eyes open for what's about to follow. So really grateful to you for coming along. And unfortunately, the person who was about to introduce Louise has taken ill, Anya Hurlbert. So I've been given the pleasure of introducing Louise. She and I go back, I think, to a dissection room together. We were in the same year at medical school. How romantic. Yeah, so she and I have sort of seen quite a lot of each other over the years, and it's just great that she's giving this talk. She's gone from strength to strength since the dissection room, though. So it's now Professor Dame Louise Robinson, and she's also our Regis Professor of Aging. And she's a beast, actually. She's an academic practicing GP, Professor of Primary Care and Aging at Newcastle University. And her research, as she will tell you, centers on improving the quality of life and the quality of care for older people, particularly those with dementia. Louise has a glittering academic track record, and just to highlight one or two areas, I mean, she leads one of 3 UK Alzheimer's Society Centres of Excellence on Dementia Care, and the only NIHR Global Research Group on Dementia Care and Prevention, with international collaborations in multiple countries that I'm not going to list, but they involve some very deprived countries and continents, including Africa and Southeast Asia. So really, I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming Louise and really looking forward to what you've got to say, Louise. Thank you.
Can I just ask, can you put your hand up if you personally have someone in your family with dementia, or you know someone who's caring for someone with dementia? Put your hands up and let me have a look. Wow, that's probably 80 80 to 90%. Okay, right. That's a lot of people, isn't it? So obviously, 90% of people in the audience are not alone, because you will be aware that there are lots of famous people who we have found out over the years have had dementia. And the most recent one, of course, very sadly, is Bruce Willis, who is only in his 60s. But increasingly, you will also be aware from the news of especially men who've been involved in professional sporting careers, in football, in boxing and rugby, who are also developing dementia at quite an early age. So one of the key things that actually we have to say before we talk about dementia risk is there is one factor that you cannot change for your risk factor, and that's age. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, what is dementia? Well, the term itself, and the man who is we have to credit for this, that's Mr. Alzheimer's there in the corner, and he was the first person to describe the symptoms associated with dementia. And everybody with dementia is different, but we associate dementia with some of these factors. Loss of memory is the obvious one, but often changes in a people's personality, difficulty finding words, becoming difficulty making decisions, and then as the condition moves into the more moderate and severe stages, difficulty actually leading a normal life and managing simple things such as moving slides with a machine. But seriously, wandering, leaving gas cookers on, and then, as you will all know, people losing the ability to speak, as Bruce Willis no longer can, and fail to recognise loved ones, and becoming often immobile and incontinent, and becoming very frail, and then dying. So dementia itself is just a term. We call it a clinical syndrome for all of these symptoms. And there are a range of different types of dementia. Alzheimer's is by far the commonest. Around 2/3 of cases worldwide are due to Alzheimer's, as Mr. Alzheimer described. But also vascular dementia, where some of the risk factors I'm going to talk about today are particularly important, is probably the second. And then Newcastle is particularly famous for Lewy body, because Professor Ian McKeith was one of the, is actually internationally recognised in getting Lewy body dementia recognised and classified. And as David has said, he's been particularly involved in dementia related to Parkinson's and some of the less common ones. And you're not alone, all of you sitting there with experience of living with dementia. This is a slide taken from Alzheimer's Disease International, from one of their publications a few years ago. And believe it or not, every 3 seconds somewhere in the world, a person is diagnosed with dementia. That's an awful lot of dementia. And the number predicts 30 years. And that's because one of the strongest risk factors for dementia is getting older. And despite what Hollywood stars think, we can't actually do much about that. Spending money on Botox and fillers and having lots of stuff done like that is not going to change, actually, your chronological age. And it's this aging population that we are seeing around the world now, not just in high-income countries. And actually, the map in the corner shows the figures predicted for Asia and China, and some of the biggest increases in dementia are going to be seen in Asia and in China in the next 20 to 30 years. And believe it or not, I don't know how this came about, but actually when they were writing this report, which was actually entitled The Global Burden of Dementia, somebody worked out that if you put together the costs of dementia, the care costs of dementia, it would actually work out at the 18th largest economy in the world, comparing it to other businesses. And we know what a costly illness dementia is. both in terms of, to us personally, living with it because it's a devastating illness, but also costs of care, because you need help not just with your mental abilities, but often with your physical abilities to look after yourself towards the end. So, dementia risk. Well, where do we begin? In a long time ago, in a university far, far away, and it could be a galaxy, but in Cambridge University, and this is the time when I was actually training to be GP, but a very good friend and colleague of mine, Professor Carol Brain in Cambridge University, was a young lecturer. And Carol, being a public health doctor, thought one of the ways of actually looking at dementia research would be to study it in the natural population. So by getting together a big number of older people and studying them as they grow older. And she was the driving force behind a very, very important study, which I think personally is probably the most important dementia research that has actually taken place in the last couple of decades. So what Carol did is she got the money together from the Medical Research Council to set up something called the Cognitive Function and Aging Study. And this sounds incredible now, but with the help of colleagues, Ian McKeith and John Bond in Newcastle and around the country of England, in England and Wales, they recruited people aged 65 and over from GP practices in 6 areas, and they managed to get 13,500 people. And then what they did was follow these people over many years, taking, if you like, looking at them and taking the same measurements, doing the same sorts of tests on them for a period of really around a decade. And what they found, and this is probably one of the first studies to show this, was that as you got older, your risk of getting dementia increased. So by the time you got to about 1995, you had a 1 in 3 chance of developing dementia. And obviously it was much less at the age of 60 or 65. And then Carol came up with the brilliant idea of actually repeating this natural experiment, what we call a cohort study, some years later, but it took a lot of time to get the actual money. And this is quite incredible, because this is a time when actually dementia research and the amount of money going into dementia research was rapidly increasing, but it was a lot of it was going into finding the magic drug. And doing something like this, where you recruit a lot of people from the community, from natural environments, and follow them up, didn't seem to be as exciting finding the magic tablet. But we managed to do it eventually, but only got enough money to repeat the experiment in 3 of the original 6 areas. That was Newcastle, Nottingham, and Cambridge. And that's when I came in, because around this time I was then a young academic GP and got involved with Carol and her team. So we managed to recruit 7,500 people, and also a year or 2 later on get some extra funding to bring back the Wales site and to do all of the tests that we'd done, that Carol and her teams had done sort of almost 2 decades before that, looking at how people age both physically and mentally, and also the sorts of, if you like, the sorts of services they used. And what we found was very, very surprising, because in that 20-year period, as David alluded to, we are a rapidly aging population. So there are a lot more older people. We're aging better, we're living longer. So you would have expected to find more dementia. Anyway, this is what we found. The blue figures, blue parts of the chart, refer to CFAS 1 from the late 1980s, and the red figures are from the CFAS 2, which was around 20 years on. And you'll see that at each age, the number of people with dementia that were diagnosed by the various tests we did was around 20% less than it had been 20 years before. And yet there were more older people in the population. And this was actually a pretty novel finding, because what the team were then able to do is actually look at all the factors, because they'd taken lots of information from all of these people, their age, their sex, and what sort of diet they had, what their physical health was like, what sort of jobs they'd done. They got all of this information, and they could actually start to look at some of the factors that, if you like, influenced why some of the people in that population got dementia and others didn't. And the other interesting thing was there had been similar cohort studies, community experiments like this from other countries in Europe and the US, and they were all reporting at around the same time. And what these cohort studies showed was that there did seem to be a number of factors that influenced your risk of getting dementia. And further research, which I'll come on to next, has actually shown that we now recognize 12 what we call modifiable, i.e. we can do something about them, risk factors that we have shown can influence your chance of getting dementia. There are some obvious ones there. They are the same sorts of factors that influence whether you have a heart attack or a stroke. So that healthy minds, healthy bodies that David alluded to. So smoking, not doing much exercise, having high blood pressure, being overweight, having diabetes. But other things started to emerge, which were interesting, which were very relevant to dementia. Low education, especially during childhood, was very significant. How much social contact and social networks you have, which makes sense. Obviously, you know, use it or lose it. We know that any part of your body, whatever you need to do, you need to exercise it, whether it's your tummy muscles or whether it's your brain. Traumatic brain injury, of course, has had a lot of interest over the last decade, as we now hear about the rugby and football players and boxers who are getting dementia. But air pollution and hearing loss are also factors. And my colleague Jill Livingston, who's an old age psychiatrist at UCL and a big team, actually did a huge bit of work looking at all of the information from CFAS studies and other similar studies to try and, if you like, work out what were actual risk factors and whether they could make a difference. And they produced this lovely diagram, which they called a life course model to dementia, and showing that through your life, you can actually influence your risk of developing dementia. So starting back in childhood and through teenage years, the more education that you have, the more protective it is. Moving then into midlife in terms of your exercise, your weight, and then in later life, if you get high blood pressure and you get diabetes, then ensuring these are treated and kept as stable as possible. But also starting to maintain your social networks as well as your physical health. And they worked out that if we looked at this and we tried to actually adopt this approach, 40% of future numbers of cases of dementia could be prevented by targeting these risk factors. And this formed the basis of a very, very lovely trial, which some of us here in England desperately tried to get money to do, but we couldn't persuade the funders to do it. But the first people to do it were Mia Kivipalto and a team in Finland. So what they said was, well, if we've got all of these risk factors, surely if we get a huge group of people, we split them into two groups, one group get an intervention which addresses physical exercise, healthy diet, keeping their blood pressure and diabetes under control, having social, making sure they have social and brain exercises. If we put all of these together into a big intervention package and we give it to one group and we don't give it to the other and we follow them up, then people in the intervention group who are doing all of these active things and keeping physically more well are surely going to do better. They're going to be less likely to get dementia. And this became known as the Fingers trial, or the Finnish, I can't remember the full term of it, but it was because it was carried out in Finland. And the 2-year follow-up findings were hopefully, as we anticipated, with 25% of people in the intervention group having much better cognition, 40% having memory function, and 83% having what we call executive function, our ability to make decisions. And the lovely thing about Mia's work and the fact that, and this took a lot of money to do because this was over 1,000 people, and I say we couldn't get this funded in England, we couldn't get the funders to back us on it. But what has happened is that this work has actually spun off a whole worldwide series of randomized trials, Fingers trials, and there's now what's called the Worldwide Fingers Network. It's all of these trials, very similar trials taking place around the world, and hopefully getting lots of data to get us more information around dementia risk factors. And this knowledge in the last 5 or 10 years actually led the World Health Organization to declare dementia as a public health challenge, i.e. it's an illness that we can do something about at a population and an individual level. And they produced this report and basically said that governments should be actually trying to address this. They should be taking action now. They should be actually ensuring that certain things are in place, such as reducing risks of serious brain injury, reducing pollution, having population-wide smoking cessation activities in. And individuals could also start to do something about their health to improve their risks. And their WHO dementia strategy, they followed this up with a whole, if you like, a life course approach as to how we can do this, beginning not just with risk reduction campaigns, but if you like, public and professional awareness campaigns and dementia policies to look at how we can not just improve the diagnosis and treatment of dementia, but actually start to address this thing about reducing risk and reducing future numbers. So the other interesting thing that CFAS, those CFAS studies did was that actually changed, if you like, the clinical guidance that we as doctors have for dementia. So the very first dementia clinical guidelines were published in 2006. And they didn't have anything about risk reduction and prevention in. And when they came to revise those clinical guidelines in 2015, when the committee was brought together, there was so much evidence around the prevention aspects that actually the guidance, which is called assessment, management and support, is actually not true, because there is a huge section in there about risk reduction and prevention. So really, it should have been called prevention, assessment, management and support. And of course, this scientific knowledge, and I don't know whether it'd be interesting to see whether any of you have tried any of these, this scientific knowledge has led to obviously a number of self-tests that you can do to work out your risk for dementia. And the ones on the right here are just some of the ones I found on my Apple iPhone, just looking and Googling and what apps I could download about working out my dementia risk. But the interesting thing is, unfortunately, yet, these are not quite grounded or as grounded in the research as we would like them to be. So they're interesting and you can use them, but I can't tell you how accurate they are based on the science, because we haven't quite got there yet in terms of translating what we know about the individual risk factors into how you can use that to work out your own individual risk. And one of the interesting dilemmas we have, if we go back to the Alzheimer's Disease International slide, is that over 2/3 of the people with dementia are living in low-income countries around the world. So the vast majority of people with dementia are in low-income countries. Most of that research that I've told you about, the CFAS studies, have taken place in high-income countries such as the UK and Europe and the United States. So the problem is we do not know what the incidence of dementia is in some of these countries where the increases are predicted to be bigger, because they haven't had the type of research, they haven't funded the type of research that we've had to help us work out these factors. And we don't know whether those same lifestyle factors, whether smoking or air pollution or traumatic brain injury, how relevant those factors are in countries like Africa and China and Asia. And it was this interesting dilemma when we came to talk about doing more research on dementia risk that actually involved the development of this big program grant, which we won in 2017. And the NIHR funded myself and my colleagues here in Newcastle to set up the first global health group looking at dementia prevention and care with colleagues in Tanzania, Kerala and Malaysia. And they were chosen because we wanted a combination of low-income countries as well as middle-income countries, but also a country from Africa, a country from Asia and a country from India. Not obviously representative because they are huge continents, but it was a start for the amount of money we could get. And some of the first bit of research we did in that programme was to look at these dementia risk tools and models that had been developed to see, if you like, which was the most accurate, to see if we could identify if there was one that we could let Apple then take and produce into an app for you to use in the general population. And Blossom Stefan and Matthew Preener and my colleagues who led on this work actually found that unfortunately none of these tools were actually sufficiently good enough at the minute. And that's why I say if you download one of these apps, be careful. If you have a go, I can't guarantee how accurate it is, and that a lot more research needs to be done in this area before we get to that point and we can make you an app that you can use on your phone. But also because there is this huge gap from low and middle income countries that in some countries we don't even know what the numbers of people living with dementia is because the research hasn't been done. And the other thing that the research we found out quite quickly in the first year was that to my colleagues in Tanzania and Kerala and Malaysia, dementia prevention was actually bottom of their list. That wasn't important to them. What was much more important was actually getting a diagnosis and getting a timely diagnosis. That led us to then change direction a little bit within the programme. And so one of my colleagues, Stella Paddick, who's a young dementia researcher here at Newcastle, what Stella was interested in, she'd already been working with my colleague Richard Walker out in Tanzania. And the thing about in Africa was that actually, as I say, people's first port of call in Africa was not to their local GP, it was to the community, we call it witch doctor, but they would say tribal doctor, and that's who they went to see to deal with any problems. And it was still an issue that people who were displaying signs of dementia were actually felt to be perhaps possessed. And that was how, you think, well, this can't be right in 2020, this can't be so, but that was the case. And so what Stella and her team wanted to do was actually try and develop something that could be used to try and help people pick up the early signs of dementia. And the other thing about places like Tanzania is they don't have the specialists, the neurologists, the psychiatrists, that we have in this country. Tanzania has 4 neurologists in the whole country. So they can't be sending people to special clinics. What they have to do is enable the nurses and the basic, the general doctors who are working out in the field, in the community, to be able to pick up some of these people because they don't have the specialists to do the assessment. So Stella's work, which is pretty unique, I think, was about developing a tool that actually nurses and field workers in the community could use. And what Stella had done is, some of you may have already had experience with this, but when you go and see the doctor and they say, what day of the week is it? Who's the Prime Minister? No, not who's the Prime Minister, that's not a great one. Who's the king, you know, and you get asked all of these sort of things. And of course, you can't use questions like that in Tanzania because 90% of the people haven't had schooling beyond the age of about 9 or 10. They're also very, if you like, country specific, those sorts of questions. So Stella had the idea of looking at what we call activities of daily living. So things that you do in functions that you do in your everyday life, and trying to use those as a way of seeing whether people were actually losing their cognitive abilities. And she put this together with some basic brain screening tests into something called the IDEA Brief Cognitive Assessment Tool. And they'd also developed this really nice thing. In this country, we asked people to draw a clock and put the numbers on and put a time on. So they found that obviously people don't have watches and don't tell the time in certain countries. So they'd used this trick with matches and found that that was equally good at doing these things. They put all these things together, and it's called the IDEA Screen. And during our global health research program, we used some of the funding to actually make that into an app to use on mobile phones, and tested it out, not just in Tanzania, in some of the villages, but also in Kerala as well. And we found that this was actually quite a useful tool for very basic nurses and primary care doctors to be using in the community. It also has the advantage of using activities of daily living in that you can culturally adapt very easily some of those questions to the country. So things that are important in Tanzania, such as they settle conflicts, they watch over the house when others are out, you can adapt those. And we've done this for Kerala, and we've also done it for Malaysia, to the country specific. So it's a tool that's easily adaptable to other areas. And another thing that we found, and certainly it was a revelation for me doing this research in different countries, whereas when I was attending conferences around the world and they were talking about the new dementia drugs that they were hoping to develop, one of the key things is that in these countries, the basic dementia drugs, the 3 dementia drugs that we have, their existence, that we have ready available in this country, are not actually available in a lot of countries around the world. And this is because despite dementia being classed as a public health issue by the World Health Organization, the 4 dementia drugs that we have are not actually on the list of WHO essential medicines. Which means, for example, when the Ukraine conflict started, because they're not on an essential medicines list, they cannot be moved in an emergency, and they cannot be, if you like, accessed at reasonable prices to get to areas where they're needed. The WHO essential medicines list has lots and lots of medicines on, and these are medicines that are supposed to be priority healthcare needs for the whole population, wherever you live. They're supposed to be affordable, so they're kept at a price that's affordable in any country, wherever you live. And they're supposed to address very common diseases that are a public health issue and for which there are cost-effective medicines available. Now, dementia ticks all of those lists, but up until this point, the dementia drugs are not on the WHO essential medicines list. So although we were coming to the end of the grant, we used the last bit of money we did to actually develop an argument, a cost-effective argument and a document, which we've submitted to the WHO at Christmas. And when they meet in April, we're hoping that they will review our evidence and actually put the dementia drugs onto the WHO essentials medicines list, which, while we're waiting for that magic drug to appear, hopefully will mean a lot more people around the world will be able to access the few dementia drugs that we do have. So The other interesting thing that I think was important for these countries is that they said, well, even if we get a diagnosis, there's no treatment or support, there's no drugs available, or if we can get them, they're very expensive and only people who are well off can have them. And actually we can't get hold of any support. There's no support for the families. And so this led us in the UK as a starter to actually go to the Alzheimer's Society and say, look, isn't it about time you put a bit more money into looking at care and support rather than just trying to find the magic drugs? And this was a big grant we got a few years ago, which was actually, although the research is UK focused, they were very keen for us to try and look at finding out models of care. What are the most effective and cost-effective models of care? And they're essentially primary care, community care delivered, that although we're looking at the UK, you could roll out to some of these less fortunate countries around the world. And this project has actually spent a lot of time looking at the best possible ways, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of supporting families with dementia. And our findings were actually selected as one of only 5 case studies looking at models of care that went into the World Alzheimer's Report in 2022, which was focused on summarising the best possible evidence on post-diagnostic care for people with dementia. Another interesting bit of work we've done based on some of the global health bit is actually, this is a toolkit called Forward with Dementia that we co-developed, a project led by Australia, but with Canada and European colleagues, because in all of these countries, just as in Africa, Malaysia and Kerala, we found that the access to support and help for people with dementia was very low. And this was about trying to bring it all together into a toolkit, into an app, which we hope, and we've submitted it for something called the Longitude Prize on Dementia, which is about looking at the role of technology in dementia. And the winners get money to actually, if you like, develop their product, but also look at, if you like, make it more applicable for worldwide use and launching it as a product on the market, not just as a research tool. So I think that's probably all I want to say. It's hopefully you feel, you know, a bit more about dementia and dementia risk than when I started. But I think the personal thing for me is I still find it very, very sad to see the bulk of money in dementia research going to find the magic drug. Now, some of you, I haven't mentioned that at all. Some of you will have read newspaper articles about a new drug that came to the news just before Christmas, the Canazab, and it's looking, you know, it's looking good, and it's been approved in the States, but that is not a cure. What that drug will do will slow the rate at which dementia progresses. It is not a cure, even if it gets available onto the market. So at the end of the day, certainly I believe that dementia is a lifelong condition. It's something that we can do something about, and we shouldn't just be waiting for the magic tablet, which may arrive, but actually when you look at some of this evidence that's been building up over the last few decades, it's increasingly liable that it's a condition that has multiple risk factors, which we are probably the best people to do something about, rather than a magic tablet. Thank you.
Great stuff. Well, thanks very much, Louise. That was really thought-provoking and absolutely, I think has made everybody kind of sit up and listen and relate some of the messages that Louise has come out with to themselves or the people who you put your hands up in relation to that you know with dementia. So we do have time for questions before the lunch break. We've got about 10-15 minutes. So I'm going to look straight back at Lauren and just check whether there's anything coming in from, and there are. But there's a hand vigorously being waved. Oh my goodness, loads of hands here. So right, you're going to be keeping fit here. So gentlemen in the multicolored top there.
Thank you very much indeed. This one I prepared earlier. I've once heard it said on a radio program, in fact, that probably may even be from you, Professor Robinson, that having multi-flocked carpet, by which I mean carpet, which is the opposite of what we got here, will somehow slow the oncoming of dementia. And I wanted to know, is there any truth in that what I heard on the radio, number one? And if there is truth, is it a generic issue? In other words, is it the same with, I don't know, wall coverings, for example, having flock wall coverings would be the same effect? And if so, is there any scientific truth in that statement?
I have to say, I haven't read any of the science around that. In terms of, there's certainly a lot of knowledge growing around the role of colour and the use of colour in people who have dementia, and how you can use and the environment to help people with dementia. But in terms of the prevention, I don't know anything about the science. No. So I think that's maybe an emerging area, which if there are any young researchers in the audience, if you get in there now, you could be a world leader, obviously, in 20 years' time.
So I wondered, really, in relation to your work that you've explained here in the beginning, how much of the findings do you think could have possibly been due to confabulation or coincidence? And I remember reading about the nun study in America, where there was a lot of variance, and we all know about people who don't follow under these things and still got dementia.
I don't think it's coincidence. I think the CFAS study was, performed with very rigorous scientific efforts. We've got lots of cohort studies, similar cohort studies around the world showing exactly the same thing. So I have no doubt about some of these things. I think what is interesting is we do not know whether those same factors apply in countries that have different cultural and healthcare systems. I think that's the difficulty now. So we don't know whether you can apply these worldwide or not.
Is there any indication that some of the risk factors identified are more significant than others in the development of dementia?
Interesting. So the Lancet Commission that Jill Livingston led, they did try and do this, looking at, they brought together all the research they could find, and they tried to, if you like, make conclusions. So they do try and do that. Interestingly, it was just in the news the other week, actually a study from the States, I think it's like 1,300 women over 65, they had found, and they looked at 7 risk factors, and it was the typical sort of vascular risk factors, so the smoking, the exercise, the diabetes. They were saying that each risk factor pertained to about 6%, and they appeared to have a cumulative and added effect. So if you addressed all 7 of those risk factors, you could reduce your risk by 42%.
Wow.
Now, that's one study from the States, so we don't know. I don't know. That's the latest I've read, though.
That's really helpful, Louise. Thank you. Good to get some numbers. So, yes, gentleman, the hand up there, and then gentleman over to the right.
Thank you. Some of those 12 risk factors look as though they kind of feed off each other or are connected. So if you experience depression, you might well reduce your social contact. And low education, is that do we know whether that's because, to put it bluntly, somebody's brain is not sufficient or is less well developed than somebody else? Or is it low education, meaning that there is less access or less ability to understand information?
Okay, so
particularly thinking of my dad, who was a London taxi driver. And in the days when you had to acquire the knowledge, which I understand leads to development of a particular part of the brain. So would that mean a lower risk of dementia because you've exercised your brain, for want of a better word, and you can work out that I'm not a medic, or alternatively increased dementia because you've kind of overdone it?
Well, you may not be a medic, but you certainly, the question's brilliant, because you're sort of querying the independence of those factors and whether they might be interrelated. So, Louise.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's really interesting, and that's a key point. And there will be people, certainly many, who say, you know, these are just factors that they're associated factors rather than causative factors. And I think that's a reasonable point. You're absolutely right. We can't separate this out. And that's why when we get to the previous question about which factor contributes the most, or with, you know, how do they all add together? And that dilemma, that scientific dilemma, is part of the reason we haven't quite yet got one of these risk assessment tools that you can do on your phone. We have managed that with heart disease. I don't know if any of you've been to your doctors, your GPs, and they have had a discussion with you about, oh, you've got a 15% risk of heart disease. That's using something called the Q-risk tool. And the Q-risk tool is specifically for heart disease, and again, was developed in a very, very similar way by looking at these big cohort studies and looking at the factors that the people who've got heart disease seem to more likely to have. But there's lots and lots of research being done around the Q-risk tool about which factors are most important and how they all add together. And that, you know, to the point that we can now roll that out in practice, and that is a useful tool. We are not yet at the point with dementia risk tools that we can have a dementia cure risk tool, and that is an interesting bit of work to be done that people are currently working on.
Great, thanks, Sarah.
And the education bit, I think again is based on these big, you know, population studies, where they look at the people who've got dementia, and those who had less education, you know, from basic school education up to higher education onwards, were most likely to get dementia. So again, you're looking at those associations, if you like.
Okay, so gentlemen here, next question, then we're going to have to move across here if there aren't any online.
Thank you. What is the physical mechanism that causes dementia? Is it possible to say? And if it's loss of protein, or it's a long degradation of a specific physical part, then would we ever be able to produce a pill that can magically restore long-term loss of whatever that physical loss or reduction is?
Well, I think that's a very fascinating question, because that is the one question I pose when I'm in meetings where 90% of the money is being allocated to the people to develop the drugs and 10% of the money is going to the care, because actually we're still not absolutely 100%, David might correct me here, but we know some of the things that happen. We know what happens to, if you like, the structural changes in the brain from the excellent scanners we've got now. We can see the sorts of changes that happen in the brain when people have dementia, to the point that we can actually say which type of dementia by putting people under special scans. But the changes that are happening, you'll have heard something called amyloid and tau, exactly why some of these risk factors are then leading to amyloid deposits in the brain, I think is still not exactly worked out. And your point about finding the magic drug, some of the newer drugs seem to prevent amyloid being laid down or speed it breaking up. But amyloid is only one factor, and it's still not clear-cut at all, which is why I'm cynical that in my lifetime we'll get the magic drug, but David might have a different view.
No,
on this.
I share Louise's concern, and also about where, you know, funding goes. I spent some time with Parkinson's UK and informed, including a trustee, and they did make a policy change to invest a lot in drug discovery, and that's fraught with danger. And the problem is that, and I'm aware of studies where you've taken bad amyloid out of the brain and the person has come to post-mortem, and that's been evidence that the amyloid has been stripped out, the bad amyloid, but they still die with dementia. So it sort of makes Louise's point that, you know, we're quite crude in, I think, how we tackle this, in terms of, yes, you've got tau in the brain, you've got amyloid in the brain, but actually it's probably a bit more subtle than that. And of course, I think behind your question as well is, once you've lost nerve cells in the brain, no matter how good the treatment, you can't put the nerve cells back. I mean, we're not at that stage remotely yet.
I was very interested to see that a genetic causative factor was not mentioned. Is there any evidence of a strong linkage?
Okay, so the reason I didn't talk about genetics was because the vast majority of dementias occur in later life, and therefore probably genetics doesn't play a huge part. So people who have young onset dementia, that we do know that there is a genetic tendency there, and there would be studies looking at people who develop young onset dementia. Certainly research has shown that something called ApoE is important, and if you have ApoE, you are more likely to get dementia with age. But I didn't touch on that because I wanted to actually give a more general talk that was relevant to the whole population, rather than people who perhaps have a genetic tendency to dementia.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. The same can be said of quite a few neurodegenerative diseases, actually, where there is a small core of very, very strongly genetically determined cause of like motor neuron disease, actually like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, like Parkinson's disease. But Louise's talk's obviously focused on modifiable environmental factors that pertain to everyone, actually.
I was going to ask about genetics, but I've got another question. I recently read about a vaccine for Alzheimer's disease. Do you think that's a treatment, and what's the future of that field?
I think I've sort of touched on that. I don't believe there will be a magic drug in my lifetime. But I hope I'm proved wrong. But I think you get a magic drug when you understand exactly what the cause of an illness is. And I think dementias are a wicked problem. I think they're very complex. Yeah. And I think we're just touching the surface. It would be lovely. But I say even the latest drug that hit the headlines that got all the newspapers excited is not a cure. It is just something that is slowing the rate of progression down, although it is showing that it's affecting how amyloid is affecting the brain, which is an improvement, but it's not a cure.
Yeah, it's sad because even in the Parkinson's field as well, I mean, the monoclonal antibody approach, which is kind of what you're sort of alluding to there. I mean, there were 2 landmark studies last year. Yes, last year, both were negative. Both negative, both designed to strip out the abnormal protein in Parkinson's. It's very frustrating. So at the back, please.
We now know that traumatic brain injury is a big problem. What about other causes of brain injury, such as infection or malnutrition, both of which are particularly seen in low to moderate income areas?
Yeah, fabulous question. And I suspect yes is the answer. And my colleague, Stella Paddick, who I mentioned there, who was the brain behind the IDEA app, her particular area of interest is actually HIV, cognitive impairment and dementia. And she spends half of her time practicing working as a doctor in Tanzania, and is seeing the HIV people who you can imagine are now living longer because of the magic drugs that are enabling them to live and live well with the illness, developing cognitive impairment and early dementia. And these are people who are much younger than the age at which we are seeing people with dementia. And so I suspect you're right. And I don't know, I'm not an expert. Stella would be the best person, but that is certainly something she's very interested and is seeking to build her research career on.
Now, we've gentlemen here, and then what we might do is just get him to throw the microphone across to the lady who's flat bang in the middle here.
My wife has moderate to severe dementia and is in a care home. But the first sign of something going wrong was her loss of smell, maybe 20 to 25 years ago. And then the next was loss of hearing. And I'm just wondering whether anyone else has noticed a loss of smell as a possible factor, early factor in dementia.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. I certainly know of studies that are going on at the minute, and also of a study we've just had funded that is being led by Imperial that we are part of, which is actually looking at sleep disturbance. So people who start to struggle to get to sleep and wander more, and then seem to be more likely because of either as a reason or because of it to get dementia. So I think these are emerging areas. I don't know the answer yet, but I think they're all interesting areas for further research.
But
Whether all these people, whether anyone else has had this problem.
I mean, I think some relative loss of sense of smell as one gets older is quite well recognized, but it's interesting you point that out, because in my own area, loss of olfaction, loss of sense of smell is a very common precursor to Parkinson's disease and well recognized. And I don't know what type of dementia your wife has, but if it's Lewy body dementia, then that would be entirely plausible. Okay. But there is overlap in these dementias, and I think that's the point Louise was making as well, that, you know, they don't go into neat boxes, so it's possible that there is some overlap. So there is some history in certain areas at any rate of that being well documented, but how they're causal or linked is not yet clear.
And
Anyway,
I think the thing which maybe people don't realise is when the newspaper headlines hit about the drugs is these are for Alzheimer's disease.
yeah.
And as we've already seen, there are lots of different types of dementia. And so even if these do come to market, there will be people who have non-Alzheimer's dementia who will not benefit.
So we're going to go lane in the middle. And then,
Firstly, thank you for a very stimulating lecture. And my question is, do animals get dementia? And do we have an animal model for investigating the causes?
Well, I think animals do get dementia. I can't, David's probably better speaking about animal models than me, but certainly animals do get dementia. And I suspect, I'm not a vet, but I suspect the same mechanisms play out in their brains. In terms of the animal model.
yes, well, I'll tell you what, let's pass the microphone down. It's entirely reasonable that we give Jim Edwardson the last question. So I think, because I am going to have to draw a halt, we've ran well over here. So can we pass the microphone? Oh, he's got it. Jim, answer the question and then you can ask yours, if that's all right.
So is this, yes. There are tens of millions, probably more, people around the world who are suffering from long COVID. Every single day, the medical press is producing more and more evidence of cardiovascular damage, of pulmonary damage, of brain inflammation, and then there are all the talks, and there are people here in this room, including myself, who have had COVID and had a long period of brain fog after it. To add to your pessimism that there's going to be no magic bullet very soon, my guess would be that very soon there could be a massive increase in numbers of people with dementia due to the consequences of the pandemic. What would your take on that be?
Well, I think it gets back to our point, doesn't it, about the role of infection or the role of factors which lead to inflammation, which we know is a key thing in aging and in long-term illnesses. I suspect you're right. I think it will be a factor, and we're just touching the surface. We know that from COVID, it seems to increase your rate of having heart disease or myopathy, cardiomyopathy after you've had COVID. So I don't know, it's not my particular area, but I suspect it will play in to some of these things as research emerges. And it gets back to this thing about other, if you like, other non-vascular factors and like infection with HIV and inflammation that they are causing within the brain.
I mean, I would share your anxiety, Jim, as well. And back to the gentleman's question on loss of sense of smell, of course, as you all of us know, that is a part of COVID. And of course, people have then tried to say, well, actually, I mean, the theory in Parkinson's is that, in fact, an agent triggers off some alteration in the protein, which is then passed almost like a relay between nerve cells from the smell within the nose back into the brain. And of course, if something similar is going on with the the virus that causes COVID, then one does worry about what the downstream consequences could be some years on. It would only be years on. And, you know, back to the lady's question about infection, you think about encephalitis lethargica pandemic, and I'm not sure if that was behind it, but that also caused major problems downstream with cognitive impairment and late onset and earlier onset Parkinsonism. So, yeah, there are some models there. And yes, there are lots of animal models for dementia, actually, particularly in the murine. But as somebody said once, in fact, many people have said, probably man, the human, is the best model for disease, really, because I used to think you could give mice M&Ms and they would show a response. And then if you put it into, sorry, I'm not American, Smarties, then you put it into humans and you just don't replicate. And this is where the money's going that Louise referred to. Right, we should draw holes. That's been brilliant. Louise has given us a wonderful lecture, a really thought-provoking lecture, which has led to an unbelievable number of questions. I've never had so many questions to have to try and field them. And I'm so sorry. I know there were a few hands went up on this side that I didn't manage to cover out, but I'm sure you'd want to join me in thanking Louise so much for her time and enthusiasm